Everyone, Peter here, coming to you from flat on my back in bed because I threw out my back. Hopefully this is the last one I record from here. Um, we have a data update from the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Energy's Energy Information Agency, which tracks energy production, usage, and prices and everything. And their data for calendar year 2023 indicates that the average price for natural gas in the country was just over $2.50 per thousand cubic feet. In fact, it bottomed out at just below $2.20 in May. And this is after a really volatile year in calendar year 2022 when, because of the Ukraine, cat's so slow. We'll just do that. Where because of the Ukraine war, there was high demand everywhere and everyone was trying to get away from Russian natural gas. In that calendar year, U.S. prices hit nearly $10, but that was nothing compared to what happened in the rest of the world, with prices for several months being above 50 and even approaching 100 in a few areas, which still boggles my mind that we actually hit those numbers. Anyway, 2023 was much calmer, and the reason for it is twofold. Number one, that the United States is not just a producer and exporter of natural gas, but it does so using a series of technologies that are broadly not applicable in the rest of the world, the shale technologies and fracking. Because of this, the United States has a break-even price in our pure shale natural gas fields, typically below $5 and in some places below $3 per thousand cubic feet. And second, we get a lot of associated natural gas production that comes from our shale oil operations, which, technically, based on how you're running the numbers, that could be free. Anyway, it means the United States is the world's largest producer of natural gas, kicking out about 120 billion cubic feet per day, or 1,200 billion cubic meters per year. And most of that is trapped in the system at home because moving natural gas from A to B is kind of difficult. There's really only two routes. One is to have a pipeline network that sends it from production to consumption locations. Usually those are within individual country because natural gas, being a gas, is hard to store. And the U.S. does have the world's largest system for distribution by far. Well, the second option is to chill it down to negative 300 odd degrees into liquid form and then put it onto a specialty tanker to send it across the ocean to someone who has a specific receiving facility who can take the liquid and regasify it without it blowing up. All of that is as expensive as it sounds. So what happened in 2022 in Europe was the Europeans used to be on a piped system that brought in stuff from northwestern Siberia for the most part. And that gave them access to reliably large and reliably cheap supplies. So when the Europeans decided to move on from the Russians, they had to go to some other piped suppliers that they have, specifically Algeria, Libya, and especially Norway, but that wasn't enough. So they had to go out and tap the world for liquefied natural gas, which is not available in large volumes in the way that piped gas from a neighbor can be. And so prices went up and up and up and up. And in the United States, we sent everything that we could. And that allowed the Europeans a degree of energy security, but only at a very, very high price point. What we're seeing now is the slow motion degradation of the Russian system, because their pipes are all oriented towards Europe and they are falling into disrepair because they're not being used. And the Russians are using all their technical experts to maintain their war effort. They do have a couple of liquefied natural gas facilities, some in the far east on the island of Sakhalin, north of Japan, and some on the Yamal Peninsula in far northwest Russia. But it is foreigners who provide the technical skills for those facilities to operate. And as those technical skills are increasingly withheld, these facilities will fall into disrepair. And, let's just say when you've got a refrigeration unit that is dealing with billions of cubic meters of flammable materials and something goes wrong all at once. We haven't had any industrial accidents at these facilities yet, but it's only a matter of time, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, I don't know how long, before those facilities go offline and then Russian natural gas will be gone. Getting it out by other means is nearly impossible. There are very few countries that can do LNG liquefaction. China is not on that list. Most of them are part of the Western Alliance plus Japan that is back in Ukraine. And if you're going to send a pipeline from the Yamal Peninsula to populated China, you're talking about the world's largest chunk of infrastructure, with roughly 70% of the terrain it's going to cross being virgin with no existing infrastructure at all. So you're talking tundra and taiga and permafrost and mountains. Building that pipeline would be a $100 billion project. It would take a minimum of 15 years. And even if it was done, the cost of operating it would be 2, 3, 4 times as much as the natural gas would be worth. So the Russians and the Chinese have repeatedly said that this pipeline is going to happen. They've been saying that for 20 years. And then you get down into the details, and the Chinese are like, yeah, and the Russians are going to pay for the operation of the pipeline. And the Russians are like, yeah, the Chinese are going to pay for the operation of the pipeline. And that's why nothing has started. So the world has to get by without Russian natural gas. And until a year and a half ago, they were the world's largest exporter. That is going to have big price implications everywhere except in countries that produce natural gas for themselves. Read the United States. Now, that means in the United States, the $2 to $3 range we're in right now is more or less normal. We're not going to go above $5 for any more than very short periods of time, because what we've discovered is that the shale gas guys can bring on wells in a matter of weeks. If you remember your shale history back between 2004 and 2011, roughly, it was all about the natural gas. And then in 2011 to 2013, oil really came into its own. And natural gas faded, not because we weren't producing it, but because we were producing it as a byproduct of oil production. What we saw in calendar year 2023 when prices were going up is that the shale guys went back to the old natural gas fields and were able to produce using the tricks they'd learned in the shale oil fields in the last 10 years. And that pushed down the cost of production and pushed up the volume of natural gas that was produced by massive volumes. And we basically got back to a balanced market. Now, the United States does have takeaway capacity to get some of that natural gas to international systems. We have roughly 10 billion cubic feet of pipeline capacity, mostly in Mexico, and about another 10 billion cubic feet for LNG, which is mostly going to Europe now. That's in comparison to 120 billion cubic feet of overall production, which is a number we now know that we can increase in fairly quick succession when we need to. So again, prices should be lower for longer. We might have those occasional spikes, but then the shale guys will just drill and bring the price right back down. Now, why does that matter to you? 3 big reasons. Number one, natural gas remains the number one fuel source for electricity generation in this country, about 40% of the total. So anything that requires electricity, which is almost everything, natural gas is the solution, at least in the midterm. And since the United States needs to roughly double the size of its industrial plant as the Chinese fade away, we basically need 50% more electricity. Natural gas is going to be a huge component of that. Second, let's say you don't like fossil fuels at all. Let's say that you're a greenie and you like solar and wind. Well, you should still like natural gas, because when the wind doesn't blow or when the sun doesn't shine, which happens, every night, you need a partner fuel in order to keep the lights on. And natural gas combined cycle power generation facilities can spin up and spin down in less than 15 minutes. So they are the best partner for green tech that we have. And while the Californians don't like to say it out loud, about half of their energy that they generate within California itself comes from natural gas, specifically because of this pairing capacity. Batteries cost an order of magnitude more. They don't last very long, and they have some other problems with their construction that is ugly from any number of strategic and green points of view. Natural gas is a known. And as long as we're going to be moving towards wind and solar for most of this country, even in increments, natural gas is the logical partner for all of it. And then the third thing is a little bit more esoteric, and that has to do with what happens in manufacturing once you decide you want to really get into everything. In globalization, we have broken up the supply chains. Energy comes from someplace, iron ore comes from someplace, steel comes from someplace else, plastics comes from someplace else. It's brought together for assembly at different locations. As the world breaks apart and we have a more national or continental system, more and more of those intermediate steps need to be done at home or near home. And a lot of those intermediate steps use raw materials that are made from natural gas. So natural gas makes naphtha, makes polyurethane, makes plastics. Naphtha makes fertilizers and pesticides, makes agricultural products. Natural gas is the base material for a lot of this stuff. And now the United States is the largest producer, supplier, and exporter of all of those intermediate products. And what we're seeing now is the U.S. moving up the production chain, moving in a greater value-added production system for all of this, so that we can still do the classic manufacturing and have the entire input system at home. So to have natural gas at these price levels for a very long time is great, and it's going to be a very long time. We largely stopped looking for natural gas about 10, 15 years ago because we knew at that time we had over 130 years of supplies at current rates of production. And we proved in 2023 that it's pretty easy to bring even more online. So this is going to be the norm for the United States while it goes through these massive reindustrialization phases. And natural gas will both power, fuel, and provide the base materials to make all of it possible. And that is not going to be replicated anywhere else. No one else can produce natural gas at the price point that the United States can. And no one else has natural gas production facilities relatively close to their population centers like the United States does. So this is our new normal, and it's going to provide the bulwark for American industry for at least the rest of this century.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here coming to you from Colorado. It is the 29th of January, and the news today is that in a drone attack, an Iranian militia operating near the border of Jordan and Syria managed to get a drone into an American base and kill 3 people in the vicinity of one of the barracks. These are the first deaths of American military personnel since the Iranians started pushing groups like the Houthis to attack Americans and international commerce in a large volume, and it's probably going to merit a response. Something to keep in mind is when the United States a couple weeks ago decided to start taking military action against the Houthis in Yemen, it wasn't because these Iranian-backed groups were attacking commerce in general. It's because they fired an anti-ship missile at a U.S. military vessel, and that's what started it all off. So working from that same logic, now that some Americans have actually died, you can expect the Biden administration to strike back. The question is how? There's kind of 3 things to consider. None of the options are great. Option number 1, you do a semi-proportionate, because the Americans always believe in overkill, assault against the militias that Iran backs either in the area in question or somewhere in the broader Middle East. The problem with this is it doesn't solve the problem. The people who are doing the attacks aren't Iranian. They're just using Iranian equipment and sometimes a little bit of Iranian intel. And even if you were to wipe them all out, they come from sectarian groups who are opposed to their local geopolitical orders. And so they tend to oppose Sunni groups who tend to be in the majority, especially in places like Jordan, or in the case of Iraq, where you have a pseudo-democracy. And in these cases, even if you were to take them all out, you just have an aggrieved minority that would, again, push people in that the Iranians would recruit. So it might make things calm down for a few weeks to months, but it's certainly not any sort of lasting solution that's going to change the logic in Tehran at all. The second option is to strike military assets in Iran proper. The idea is you go after the personnel that are making these decisions. The problem here is that there's a lot of them. Iran isn't like most strongman autocracies. You've got a ruling elite of the religious class, the mullahs, who's over 10,000 people. And even if you were to somehow magically carry out an assassination program and within 24 hours kill the top 1,000 of them, I mean, sure, they'd have some reshuffling, but it actually wouldn't disrupt the regime in any meaningful way. In addition, Iran is a series of mountains. It's basically a fortress. And if you wanted to go in there and knock the government out, you would need a force significantly larger than what the United States pushed into Iraq, which is ultimately a flat and somewhat desert community. And that means you're going over mountain range and mountain range and mountain range. So the distances are far. The logistics would be hard. The geography plays to the defender's strength. And then even if you were successful, well, then what? Are you going to stick around and try to reconstruct Iran in the way that we did Iraq? I think the U.S. learned that that's not an easy thing to do. So, and again, this wouldn't change any of the logic in Iran about what they're doing in the broader region. If anything, it would intensify it. That leaves us with the third option, which is a military option against Iran's economy. Now, Iran, while it is nowhere near the peak that it once was back in the 70s as an oil producer when it was exporting more than 4 million barrels a day, is still in the game. It still exports about 1 million barrels a day, and that income is the primary source of hard currency that the Iranians use to fund everything that they do, from purchasing social stability from their population at home to funding these rocket attacks against U.S. military targets throughout the broader region. And unfortunately for the Iranians, it all flows through a single point called Karg Island, which is on the northeast shore of the Persian Gulf. And it would be very, very, very easy for the United States just to destroy the loading facilities or maybe even the storage tanks and the pumping stations in Karg. They could probably do it with a handful of sorties. It would probably take less than an hour. Iranian missile defense is not very good. Their air defense is not very good either. And the U.S. obviously is very good at striking in those sorts of conditions, especially when you're talking about something that is on the coast, so you don't have to fly over too many defensive layers to get to it. There'd be a cost to this, of course. Should the United States decide to do this step, it would take the role of the erstwhile global guarantor of maritime security and have the United States taking very discrete shots at very specific parts of the global economy that have relied upon international security in order to function. And that means that any vessels that are part of a long supply chain, a long sail, going through a dangerous area, near a dangerous area, or have multiple supply chain steps, meaning that if you interrupt just one of them, all of them become defunct, all of that would be in danger. And that is the entire electronic supply chain in Southeast Asia and East Asia. That is the entire oil supply chain, which either is sourced from or passes through the Middle East. The consequences of that would be significant on a global basis. But if you want to take the American populist view, which is something that Biden and Trump agree on, is that a lot of that doesn't really matter. And in fact, there's something to be said for stalling those international systems because they favor North American solutions. The United States doesn't get energy from this region anymore. Canada doesn't. Mexico doesn't. So the economies that we care about the most are heavily insulated already. And the economy that we're most dependent upon or the most concerned about is China, and they get all of their energy from this region. Well, not all, but like half. And so if the Biden administration does take this step, things will very much be in motion very quickly. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from above the very active Kilauea volcano. That's the crater that cooked off last year. Today we're going to talk about an assault that happened last week. The Ukrainians sent a squad of drones north out of Ukraine over Russian airspace into the Gulf of Finland to attack the Uga-Ust, hope I pronounced that right, oil refinery and loading facility. Now, normally this wouldn't really matter because normally drones, as we've seen, can't get through any sort of meaningful air defense, but the Russian air defense in this area appears to be just as crappy as it is everywhere else in the country, so a bunch of them got through. The other reason I wouldn't normally care about this is most refineries, everyone gets all ooh and ah, they expect Hollywood explosions when a bomb goes off in a refinery. You know, you gotta keep in mind scale here. Most refineries are over a square mile, and this one's no exception. There's a lot of standoff distance among the different facilities, so if something does blow, it doesn't blow up the whole thing. And crude oil at room temperature isn't even flammable. So the warheads that these bombs can carry, which are less than 100 pounds, probably with the models that were used, probably under 20 pounds, it's not that you can't do damage, but you can't do real damage. But this is not just a refinery. This is also a loading facility. And in a refinery, once you've made your fuels being more flammable than raw crude, you then put them into a truck or a pipe and send it away. With a port facility, you put into a big giant tank, and then a large vessel comes by and sucks off what it needs and goes on its merry way. And so the tanks themselves are the vulnerable points here. Now, judging from the size of the explosions and the fires that were started, the tanks were not hit. That's just something that you should have in the back of your mind when you're evaluating when somebody says a refiner or a certain piece of energy infrastructure was hit, so you know what to look for. What's interesting here, two things. Number one, it took the Russians more than 3 days to put out the fire, and they put it out the wrong way, using water in, the near Arctic winter, which caused a lot of water to freeze and then expand and wreck more infrastructure. Damage assessments are still underway. We don't know how bad it was, and had this been a normal attack, we would have known within 24 hours whether or not anything substantial had been done. But here we are nearly a week out, and we still really don't have any more but the vaguest ideas, and the facility is shut down. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this matters. Number one, while the Europeans have put sanctions on seaborne crude, seaborne oil product is in a loophole. So they were still taking stuff from this facility, and with its shutdown, all of a sudden, sanctions have gone up to a whole new level, and we're going to have a very good idea of how the Europeans can absorb or not this newest change. Quick add-on. The Ukrainian attack on Ust-Luga was on Sunday the 21st, and less than 72 hours later, the Russians were able to begin shipping out again. However, what is being shipped out is primarily, well, almost exclusively, oil and something called condensate, which is kind of a raw product somewhere between natural gas and oil. The actual refining complex remains completely offline. There's no naphtha, there's no fuel, there's no intermediate products that are coming out at all. And at present, the Russians are still completing their damage assessments, and at the pace they're going, we probably won't have any information on the level of damage until probably March. And then, with their very, very thin remaining skin of skilled labor, they can start talking about repairs. Second, this is the first significant Ukrainian attack against a significant economic asset of the Russian Federation, and at least on the surface, it looks like it was much more successful than they ever thought was possible. That means that the northern parts of the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland are suddenly in a danger zone that is well within the Ukrainians' proven range of operation. Now, the Ukrainians and the Russians haven't really gone against civilian shipping right now, but I can't think of a better target than an oil loading and refining platform such as what we've got in Ust-Luga. Again, apologies for the national. We're just going to put the spelling right here so you can see what I'm having the trouble with. Okay. So this is the sort of thing we should now watch for in the future, because this is not the only facility of this type which is within the Ukrainians' reach. There are a number of facilities at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and Tuapsa on the Black Sea, and closer to St. Petersburg, also on the Gulf of Finland. And now that the Ukrainians have proven that a few things can slip through, you can bet that they're going to target all of them. And all told, if you look at all of the infrastructure combined, its combined export and throughput capacity is in the vicinity of 3.5 million barrels a day, which is about 3.5% of global output. So if you put a meaningful dent in the export infrastructure, it's impossible for the Russians to shunt this stuff somewhere else. There's nowhere else to go. And so it just backs up through the system. There's also one other thing to look at. The fact that the damage control crews proved to be so incompetent is something that we're starting to see at the edges, as the Russian economic system phrase. The Soviet educational system collapsed back in 1986, which means that the youngest people who are worthy of terms like engineer turned 64 this year. And so when I think of fire suppression, I think of something that normally I could not just pick up the hose and go do it. You want someone with specialized training. And especially if you're talking about petroleum, natural gas, or refined product fires, you definitely want someone who has some idea what they're doing. Russia's running out of those people. It's not just that 1 million people have fled the country and 500,000 have been drafted and committed to the war, been killed. They don't have much of a skilled labor pool left, and what they do have is being dedicated to the war itself, air defense in the vicinity of the war, or the military-industrial complex to keep the war going. So we're seeing some very serious frays with the system. This is not the sort of thing that they should have gotten wrong. That fire should have been put out very quickly with things like foam, and it wasn't. And that suggests the Russians' ability to maintain their overall system is starting to feel the strain of all of this, and they don't have a backup plan. There isn't enough labor in the country to redirect from somewhere else, especially skilled labor. All right. That's it for me. Take care. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Kalea at the southern point of the island of Hawaii. Got the slopes of Mauna Loa behind me, the larger volcano here. I am going to take something from our Ask Peter forum. We're going to put that link here at the end of the video, too, in case you were sending your own questions. And it's, am I worried about Ukraine in the light of what has become an American boycott on weapons supplies? And yes, I am. The Ukrainians are running out of ammo. There's no way they could produce enough to support the war themselves. And the Russians have mustered a fresh human wave. And, human waves are very vulnerable to mass fire, but you have to have ammo for that to work. So there are some concerns we might be seeing a turning point in the war here in the next few weeks if something doesn't change. But what is going on is we've got a dozen, roughly, Republicans on the right who are blocking anything from happening in Congress that they don't agree with. And so this is not a Ukraine problem. This is an everything problem. These few reps are blocking anything on any issue. So we've got programs that need to be addressed, not just Ukraine, but aid for Taiwan against China, aid for Israel against Hamas, There's issues with healthcare and business reform and criminal justice reform, the defense system and the budget. Every single thing has been dropped. It's not that these folks oppose Ukraine per se, it's they oppose anything that isn't exactly their way. So I call them the Greenpeace faction of the Republican Party because they just hate everyone. This means that this Congress has been the least productive in American history. At this stage in Congress, a little bit more than halfway through their session, we've only passed about 20% of the bills that the second least productive Congress in history has passed. So this isn't an issue of big government versus small government. This is just an issue of dysfunction, and it's a problem for everybody. Now, I don't think it's going to get any better any soon. When the Republicans didn't do very well in the last midterms, the hope of getting a big majority vanished. So they had a very slim minority beginning, and they have seen that minority shrink down. In part, it's because they've cannibalized their own. This faction of Republicans forced out the former Speaker, McCarthy from California, and so he just quit. He left the House altogether, leaving that seat open. We've had another couple of resignations since, and then the Republicans purged one of their own, Republican Santos of New York, for, let me make sure I get this right, using campaign finance to purchase gay fetish foot porn. Can't make this shit up. Anywho, what it means is not just that the margin that the Republicans have in the majority has gotten smaller and smaller, it's worse than it sounds. Because to pass something in Congress, you don't need a majority of the votes, you need a majority of the seats. And so every empty seat kind of acts as a quasi-vote against the majority. So they only have the Republicans now only have a margin of 2. They can only lose 1 vote if they still want to get things passed. And that makes each individual faction, including the Greenpeace faction, more powerful. So this is going to go one of 2 ways. Number one, they're going to continue to stall everything, and this Congress will go down in history as the most pathetic ever until we have general elections a year from now, November, and the new Congress would sit in January. Or the bulk of the Republicans reach across the aisle and start cutting deals with centrist Democrats. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of minutia. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of noise. And in the environment that we're in right now, anyone who reaches across the aisle is inviting a primary challenge from the freak wings of their parties, whether it's the Greenpeace faction or the Republicans or the squad version of the Democrats. So none of these are easy decisions, but they do suggest that drama in Congress is going to increase, or rather than decrease, in the months ahead. And that's not just bad for Ukraine. That's bad for everyone, except for the Chinese who think this is fantastic. All right, that's it from me. Take care. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from St. John's Cathedral in Detroit, which is also a resort because modern Catholicism. Anyway, I thought it would be a great backdrop to talk about the United Kingdom in our Post-America series. The United Kingdom is one of those countries that is not really going to emerge into a post-American world because they've got some really interesting decisions to make, and I'm pretty sure I know how it's going to go. So, backdrop, 2 things. First, economy. The British system never really adapted to the end of empire. They do all the high value-added stuff, and they import a lot of the raw materials and some of their base manufactured goods, things that they're not very good at because they're good at the really high precision stuff. And when the empire ended and they joined Europe, all they did was kind of switch one empire for another and relied upon the European continent for things like foodstuffs and wood products and automotive. They never made the transition that all the other former imperial powers did. And so when Brexit happened, they found themselves in a bit of a lurch. So that's kind of the economic side of things. On the security side of things, they are an island, and islands are worried about one thing: other countries developing navies that might allow an invasion. So they've always looked at the major powers of the Eurasian landmass with more than just suspicion, outright fear and concern, whether it's Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or whatever, Napoleon, and on and on. But that doesn't mean that they like non-military superpowers. So when folks in the European Union start talking about ever closer union and maybe having a common defense identity, they get a little squeamish and they want to keep things within NATO where they've got veto power. So that's the economic, that's the security. You play that forward to where we are right now, and they're in a bit of a pickle. Demographically, the European Union is on its final legs. Most of the major powers, especially Germany and Italy, are going to be aging into obsolescence within a decade. and most of the remaining countries within 2. And I don't mean to suggest that the UK has a super healthy demography, but it is like the second healthiest within the Union. So when the Brits started talking about Brexit a decade ago, I was like, okay, I can understand the conversation. Getting a jump on what's next, leaving the sinking ship that is the economic aspect of the European Union, that makes some sense. But here we are 7 years after Brexit, and the Brits are still trying to figure out what Brexit means. We still don't have a meaningful policy for how they should go into the new world. And they really only have 2 choices. Option 1, since they haven't done that economic change post-imperial era, is to find a new empire and go out and cut a series of deals with a series of countries that have young demographics that can provide them with raw materials and on and on and on. The problem is they can't do it like they did before. Before, the secret of the British Empire, the reason that they ruled the world for the better part of 2 centuries, is they were in the early days of the industrial era and no one else had caught up. So they were able to use the order of magnitude greater economic intensity of early industrialization and the 3 orders of magnitude better power projection of military technologies to dominate wherever they went with a very small number of people. Well, that's not the world we're in anymore. You can't go into a place like India with 50,000 people and conquer it like you could 2-3 centuries ago. Not to mention that the Indians wouldn't let it happen. So the idea that the Brits as a mid-sized power can be the center of a global trade node, that's a bit of a stretch. I don't want to say it's impossible because weirder things have happened in the last few years, but it's difficult to see enough countries signing on to the idea of British preeminence when the Brits can't force the issue. The second issue is to partner with a singular, large, wealthy country that has better demographic structures and shares the United Kingdom's overall security concerns about United Eurasia as a military power. And the only country that scratches that itch is the United States. Now, it's not like what the Brexiteers said, that they can just waltz into Washington and ask for a free trade deal that is better than what comes from the EU. No. When it comes to trade deals, the United States is very specific, and it doesn't like to bring in systems that could compete with in any meaningful way. And that would mean that the Brits have to accede to American demands on any number of sectors, from agriculture to finance to manufacturing. Hell, we might even make them get rid of the metric system if we're in a bad mood. Now, when the Johnson administration in Britain came over to talk to Donald Trump's administration about a trade deal, and they found out what the conditions would be, they walked away. And then the next government came in and did the same thing and walked away. Or was it Theresa May? Anyway, there were 2 back-to-back. And so the Brits right now are in this netherworld where they kind of quietly admit to themselves that in order to find a future that has some degree of economic functionality, they have to get into bed with their kids and accept all the demands. And the hit to their economy will be real, and the hit to their ego will be massive. But the alternative, trying to build an alternate system or maybe going back to the EU, neither of those are long-term solutions that are very functional. So really what we're doing is going through the paces until the Brits admit the obvious. And when that happens, Britain will lose the thing that it values the most, its freedom to act, its agency. It will become a subsidiary of the American system, for better or for worse. And while that will be horrible for the British mindset, it is the best game in town from both an economic and a security point of view. And in time, I have no doubt that that is where the Brits will end up. So stiff upper lip. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. Now, I get a lot of flack for never having good news, so I figured, here's something fantastic that's happened over the holidays. There's an organization called SunZia, which is a company that produces and transmits electricity, that has closed funding and started construction on what will be the largest green tech power generation system in the hemisphere, 3.5 gigawatts, which in electrical terms is huge. Why does this matter? A bunch of reasons. Number one, $11 billion is how much money they had to raise. Raising money these days is difficult because the baby boomers are majority retired. All of their capital and all their savings has been put into relatively static things like cash and T-bills. And so if you're trying to raise funding for anything, it's gotten a lot more expensive. In addition, Unlike if you were to build, say, a natural gas power plant or anything that's fossil fuel based, with those systems, fossil fuels, only about 1/5 the cost of your full life cycle cost for your facility has to be raised at the front end to pay for construction. But most of it is instead raised from fees when you're generating the power as you go. Instead, with green tech, 2/3 of the cost is up front because there's no fuel cost, but the upfront cost is much higher. So you're talking about 2/3 of the total value of the entire life cycle of the project has to be raised before day one. And so doing that at all is difficult now that capital costs have roughly tripled, but SunZia was able to pull it off. So number one, big achievement for the capital cycle. Number two, the size, 3.5 gigawatts, biggest in the hemisphere. If we are going to do the green transition, we need to increase the amount of power generated in the country by at least 50%. This is a nice little bite taken out of that. But from my point of view, if we're going to deal with the post-China world and expand the industrial plant to manufacture everything we need to expand it by another 50%. So regardless if you're green, if you're pro-development, or both, this takes us a significant step forward. We still need like another 500 of these steps, but we're going in the right direction. Okay, number three, what it is. It's wind, and it's in New Mexico. So wind, as a rule, is much more cost-effective than solar, in large part because every time the sun goes down, all those solar panels just become paperweights, whereas the wind blows at night. In addition, while we have had incremental improvements in the capacity of photovoltaic cells over the last 15 years, it's nothing compared to what has gone on with wind. It used to be that wind turbines were 100 feet tall. Well, this year, we're going to have prototypes for ones that are 1,000 feet tall. Just massive, massive structures. And they generate more than an order of magnitude more power than the old ones do. And more importantly than their size is their height, because they're reaching wind currents that are far more stable and far stronger. And so we're seeing places in Texas, in Iowa, and now in New Mexico that are using some of these taller turbines to not just generate intermittent power, but baseload power. And that's one of the big problems with green tech. If the wind stops or the sun goes down, you're kind of out of luck and you have to switch to a more conventional system or a battery system, which is much more expensive. But if you are tapping a wind current that never stops, you can use it for baseload and avoid both of those problems. And that's part of the goal here for the SunZia project. But fourth, and I think most importantly, is that unlike almost every green tech project that we have done in the United States to this point, a huge portion of the SunZia project is transmission. They realize that there aren't a lot of people in New Mexico, and Albuquerque can only suck up so much power. And so this project includes massive transmission lines that go into Arizona and link into the network that goes into Los Angeles. And of the 3.5 gigawatts of power generation that they're anticipating, all but 0.5 gigawatt of it is for export to the Arizona and California markets. And the fact that this taps into the LA market is beyond awesome. I don't know how many of you have heard of California, but doing business there is almost impossible. Electricity demand is hardly encouraged, but in many ways, electricity generation is flat out illegal. A very heavy regulatory environment. The state is also very power hungry, and they import about 1/3 of their electricity because they've made it very difficult for producers to operate in their home state. Arizona is by far the single largest supplier they have. And every night when the sun goes down and all those panels that Californians built stop working, 10 gigawatts of fossil fuel power comes from Arizona across the border, flooding into the LA zone. The SunZia project will now be able to put roughly 3 gigawatts of power into that network. It doesn't solve it at a stroke, but it's a much more sustainable program from an environmental point of view than anything that we have right now. So, great step forward. One of the big things that we forget about in the wind and solar is not just the intermittency. It's just that not everybody's place is sunny and not every place is windy, and most people don't live in those locations. So our best wind locations are the Great Plains, from eastern Montana, North Dakota, going down to the panhandle of Texas and West Texas. Our best solar zone is from Southern California going into West Texas as well. New Mexico is on the edge of that Great Plains region. Great wind potential, great solar potential. But there aren't a lot of people in that entire area. You got to wire it somewhere. And this is one of those projects that has managed to work out the details of crossing state boundaries, 2 of them, and getting power to where people actually live in Phoenix and Los Angeles. So we need many, 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 many more of these for this to go. But the fact that we have our first really big one that's already started construction, first power is expected in 2026, it's a great start.